morning. Wache, bonjour. The Prime Minister's trip last week to Kamloops was the perfect opportunity to repair his broken relationship with the survivors of the residential schools. Instead, he continued in the dismal patterns of denial and prevarication. He falsely stated that the government has turned over all the relevant documents to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. And this falsehood was quickly exposed as the government continues to stall on turning over the school narratives and the supporting documents that were used in the independent assessment process. And nowhere is the abuse of rights and the failure to turn over documents more glaring than in the treatment of the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School. Because when the hearings for the compensation were being held, the Justice Department of Canada deliberately withheld thousands of pages of police evidence, and further, they supplied false POI, that's persons of interest reports, on some of the more notorious criminal abusers of children. So for the cases relating to Oblate priest Father Jules Laguerriere, the government supplied a one-page POI report when in reality they had evidence on this perpetrator that ran 3,191 pages. For the notorious abuser Father Arthur Lavoie, the Justice Department gave the hearings a short two-page report, when in fact they suppressed 2,472 pages of his horrific and relentless abuse against innocent children. Survivors who suffered at the hands of this monster were challenged by government lawyers. Survivors who came forward in good faith, like Evelyn Korkmaz, were not believed by a process that favored the Justice Department and the Catholic Church. These survivors were denied the compensation that was entitled to them because the government lied and suppressed evidence. And I think now of Stella Chapman, who stood here with us just a few years ago, a survivor of horrific abuse. She begged Carolyn Bennett to turn over the POI report so she could get justice, and they never complied. For 8 years, survivors of St. Anne's have fought through the courts for justice. And to this day, the Prime Minister continues to refuse to turn over the reports in numerous cases and denying justice. But now we have a better picture of the scale of the abuse of the legal rights of St. Anne's survivors. The latest report by Justice Ian Pitfield reveals some damning numbers. So what is the Pitfield report? Well, facing the enormous pressure from the ongoing media reports on the betrayal of rights of the St. Anne's survivors, Minister Carolyn Bennett went to federal court to call for the appointment of a review process run by Justice Pitfield. Now, it's really important to make this clear. The government wasn't concerned about the deliberate denial of justice to survivors. They were upset that the St. Anne's survivors were making them look bad. So I've supplied you with the addendum to the government's legal filings to the federal court, where the government accuses Murray Sinclair, St. Anne's survivor, Edmund Matatawaban, Evelyn Korkmaz, of undermining the public's faith in the government because they spoke out against these kangaroo hearings. And I have to say to my friends in the media, you're not free either. Oh no. The government went to federal court to say the CBC made them look bad. They went to federal court saying APTN made them look bad, and the Globe and Mail. Oh, and also Canadian Press. So when the Pitfield report was set up, it wasn't established for justice for the survivors. It was established to be a whitewash for the government. And I note that in his report, Justice Pitfield doesn't lose much sleep over the fact that survivors went into hearings without access to evidence that was in the hands of the defendants, the Catholic Church, and Canada. But nonetheless, Justice Pitfield reveals that at least 81 survivors of horrific child abuse will need to have their cases re-examined. 81. This represents a massive miscarriage of justice. And on top of this, the government has deliberately excluded a number of problematic cases that Pitfield has not been able to examine. For example, Evelyn Korkmaz's case. So what kind of credible process would let the defendant, Canada, who suppressed the evidence in the first place, decide what the review process actually gets to look at? And on top of this, we've learned that Justice Pitfield will not speak to a single survivor. No survivor is being included in this process, and their legal rights are not being respected. Mr. Prime Minister, you have to take responsibility for this miscarriage of justice. These survivors have done no wrong. For year after year after year, they have come here to Ottawa, they've come to federal court, they've asked for a simple thing, for closure. And yet you and your ministers and your lawyers have played a cruel cat and mouse game to try and deny them access to justice. The survivors are tired of having to do this. This is your responsibility, Mr. Prime Minister, to do the right thing, to comply with the court orders, and to bring closure once and for all for the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour demander au Premier ministre, M. Trudeau, d'assumer la responsabilité des abus de justice perpétrés contre les survivants des pensionnats de Sainte-Anne. Les avocats du gouvernement ont caché des milliers de pages de preuves de horribles abus des enfants et de violences sexuelles à Sainte-Anne's. La décision de cacher les documents a sapé les tribunaux et nié justice pour les survivants de Sainte-Anne's. Le nouveau rapport du juge Pitfield a révélé que la majorité des survivants de Sainte-Anne's n'avaient pas accès aux preuves pour l'audience judiciaire. C'est un abus de justice. Aussi, le juge Pitfield déclare qu'au moins 81 cas devront être réexaminés. C'est une grave erreur judiciaire. Alors qui va assumer la responsabilité de cet abus délibéré de la justice? C'est la responsabilité de M. Trudeau. Il a protégé son ministère et ses fonctionnaires. Il doit prendre responsabilité pour cet abus de justice. Il doit mettre en place un processus pour garantir les droits légaux des survivants de Sainte-Anne. Il n'est pas de réconciliation au Canada sans justice pour les survivants de Sainte-Anne's. There is no reconciliation possible in Canada without justice for the St. Anne survivors. I will now turn it over to Evelyn Korkmetz, and then we will have Deputy Grand Chief Rebecca Friday from Mushkegowuk Tribal Council, followed by Deputy Grand Chief Annabette Anishpaniskum from the Anishinaabe Aski Nation, representing the leadership of Treaty 9. Thank you.
Wache, good morning. My name is Evelyn Korkmetz, a St. Anne's Residential School survivor, an international and national advocate on clergy sexual abuse. I would like to thank the media for continuing to focus on this very important issue for all residential school survivors and their families. I would like to thank Charlie Angus for his dedication and persistence to hold the government accountable. A big thank you to NAN Deputy Grand Chief Annabette Anishpaniskum and Mushkegowuk Deputy Grand Chief Rebecca Friday for their support and commitment. Gishchaminguish to Dr. Edmund Matatawaban for his persistence for seeking justice for the horrific acts of genocide committed at St. Anne's Residential School. St. Anne's Residential School survivors are demanding that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sit down to meet over the massive miscarriage of justice we, as survivors, have suffered at the hands of his government. An internal review of handling of the St. Anne's child abuse cases by Justice Pitfield reveals the vast majority of the 427 survivors were heard despite facts that the government suppressed police evidence verifying the crimes, and all that at least 81 cases will need to be re-examined. St. Anne survivors are demanding Prime Minister Trudeau to sit down and explain how we will address this massive miscarriage of justice. I personally want the Prime Minister to explain why the government not only withheld names and evidence of the perpetrators, but are refusing to turn over the person of interest reports that would allow survivors to have closure on our files. Since March 2016, I have been asking for court disclosure reports to be enforced against the government. The Canadian courts have refused to enforce court orders against government officials, even after the Supreme Court of Canada said that the courts have a duty to enforce for each claimant. What good are court orders for Indigenous people when there are no consequences for contempt of court orders by the government and church officials? We as survivors need to make decisions for our own claims. What kind of system do we have in Canada when the government deliberately suppresses thousands of pages of police evidence in cases of horrific child abuse? The Prime Minister needs to tell us why he is siding with the church officials and predators of these crimes. He needs to do the right thing and end the cover-up. It is time to sit down with the St. Anne survivors so we can have justice and closure for the crimes committed by the Catholic Church and Canada when we were children. The Pitfield report is a mere glimpse into the denial of justice by the federal government. What happened to St. Anne's survivors represents a massive miscarriage of justice, and yet we see no effort by the Prime Minister to reach out to us survivors or to ensure that our legal rights are protected. In closing, I would like to say, if Canada's justice system does not work for the Indigenous people, is it because the system can't or won't shed its colonial legacy? Thank you.
Waje bugun witonestanina anusha kapejamia hote amia gechugo gaya tabachmur katibachmur chigilok osito bugun wia bastan dishigishon mingwesh magabugun misani tawnikan kapejwichi goyahok Charlie Angus Moj ganiganish kakegono gemaonek. Good day, my name is Rebecca Friday. I'm the Deputy Grand Chief of Muskego. What I just said in my own language was very important to me. And I just thanked all the people that are here at the front supporting Evelyn, including Charlie and I and Anna Betty. So it's very important that I say my statement in my own language. Many of the Muskego people, including my own family, were forcibly taken from their home as children and institutionalized in residential schools. One of the most of these was the St. Anne Institute in Fort Albany. I do not like to call it school because it was not that. It was a horrible institution meant by our government not to educate, but to strip the children of their language, culture, and tradition. The federal government has denied justice and truth about St. Andrews for over 100 years. But while it was operating on during secret police investigation, and during the settlements of the claims of the residential school survivors, documents were held by the government from police investigation were hidden many years by the government's lawyers. These documents would have proven the claims of those survivors. And, you know, still today, the government refused to reopen the process and has fought school survivors every step of the way. Is this the reconciliation the Prime Minister claims to believe in? We will not go away and be silent. We will continue to speak the truth. The Prime Minister steps forward to publicly recognize this truth and agree in bringing the real restitution for survivors and their communities. Then we can begin to talk about reconciliation. I wrote an affidavit back in 2016 that would explain the situation. There was an epidemic of suicides in our region, and it's still happening today. So it is time for the remaining survivors of St. Andrews to have a face-to-face meeting with Prime Minister to acknowledge this horrific harm that has been done. Minister Bennett came to Arawabaskat. She did nothing since 2016 when she came. Because of the horrors of the residential schools and the complete cover-up by the government, many of my people were struggling to find a path forward to a better future. Many struggled with opiate addiction and homelessness. Suicide has taken a toll in our communities. We need culturally appropriated programs to address these issues. The government needs to step and put in place adequate funds to address these issues immediately. Many years ago, the government of Canada had a policy to get rid of the Indian problem. They spent enormous amount of money to build and operate these residential schools to achieve this. It is time the government spend the same amount of effort addressing the damage it has done. The Prime Minister and his new cabinet needs to stop fighting us and instead give us support as we try to recover from the harm inflicted on us. It is time for the truth. It is time for action. It is time for change, and then we can have reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Wache, good morning. My name is Anna Betty Achnivaneshkam, and I represent Anishinaabe Nation. There are 49 First Nations within our Indigenous government. On behalf of the people of Anishinaabe Nation, we remain in support and stand with all survivors of our territory. I'd like to thank the media for being here. MP Charlie Angus, Evelyn Korkmaz, who has continued tirelessly to seek justice, and Gitchimingwech, to Deputy Grand Chief Rebecca Friday. The survivors of St. Anne's Residential School suffered inconceivable horrors as children, and it is unconscionable that the federal government continues to re-traumatize them by dragging them through the courts and their relentless effort to deny their justice. You know, we are very proud, and we will continue to stand with Evelyn, and all of St. Anne survivors, and all of the survivors throughout this country. And we are very honored of their courage and perseverance throughout this endless process. Many survivors have their lives have ended, or their health is failing. And you know, this battle must stop. You know, they should have this opportunity to relay their experience and to receive the justice. We are profoundly disappointed that the Prime Minister, that his actions have not matched the words that he has shared with many of us, especially when he talks about reconciliation. And speaking about the truth. The prolonging this senseless legal battle makes a mockery of the government, of the government's commitment and reconciliation. This cannot be reconciling. There is no reconciliation without justice. Tomorrow, when the federal government swears in, we ask that you remember the words of the survivors. We ask that you remember all the families who have found their loved ones within the mass graves of this country, and that you must stand behind the words of reconciliation. Jimmy-gwech.
Thank you. We'll take any questions.
Thank you. We will now proceed to questions. We ask journalists to ask one question and one follow-up. Merci. Nous allons maintenant prendre des questions. Nous demandons aux journalistes de prendre une question et une question de suivi. We will start in the room today. Steph?
Good morning, Stephanie Taylor with the Canadian Press. Thanks so much for your time. I'm interested in hearing not only from yourself, Mr. Angus, but from some of the Deputy Grand Chiefs as well. What do you think about Carolyn Bennett, Mark Miller, perhaps staying in their roles for tomorrow? They are leads on a lot of the files that you were talking about, as well as the Justice Minister. Should Carolyn Bennett stay in her role? Should Mark Miller stay in his role? What would you like to see?
Well, thank you. We have met many times with Carolyn Bennett attempting for her to address the abuse of justice against the St. Anne survivors, and her response every single time was to rely on her lawyers. She has failed to test a reconciliation. She has no business being in cabinet for the millions that she spent to try and deny justice. And if the Prime Minister wants to send a clear message that he's going to listen and he's going to change, he needs to have someone new at the table that can restore confidence in the survivors. Does anyone else want to speak to that?
Thank you for that question. Overall, it is the Prime Minister who has the responsibility of ensuring that his ministers follow the mandates. And those mandates, you know, there is a lot of evidence already that that the relationship with Indigenous people must be strengthened and honored. And some of our former ministers, including Minister Bennett, have not complied with that. Mingwich.
Thank you for the question, and I'm just going to be blunt here. I think Carol Bennett has to go. She has not responded at all to the first people of this country, especially St. Anne residential school survivors. She has said time and time again she will reconcile, but you know, from the tone of their voice, and it's the same with Miller, Minister, Indigenous Minister Miller. I think he has the same story, you know, what they follow from their peers. So I think we have to really, you know, get things rolling. We're not going to come back here. So we need to be sure and be mindful that what they're saying or are going to be saying for the next, maybe if they're in power for more 3 years or 4. So is it going to be the same story again? So we have to reconsider the, you know, the first people of this land. You know, we need to be very mindful that whoever's going to take the positions in those 2 powerful positions regarding me, they get paid by me. So this is why, you know, they're in the office because of me. So they have to really reconcile with the survivors if they want to be if they want the truth to come out. Thank you very much.
As a follow-up, there's another potential appeal pending on the court case in terms of the federal courts dismissing the judicial review sought from the federal government over compensating First Nations children who face discrimination from the Human Rights Tribunal as well as Jordan's Principle. The federal government has not ruled out an appeal. The time is ticking on that. I think it's the end of this week when they have to make that decision. What message does that send to all of you, any of you, and what would you like to see happen in this case?
The Prime Minister has 4 days left to do the right thing for reconciliation, for justice in this country. They have spent millions fighting Cindy Blackstock, the AFN, and the Indigenous children of this country. The Prime Minister needs to take responsibility for this. He needs to sit down with the litigants. He needs to sit down with Cindy Blackstock and the AFN. He needs to admit that the harms are not historic, they are ongoing. He needs to drop the ongoing appeal against the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that his government has just filed. He needs to agree to stop the federal court hearings. He has filed 20 legal actions against Indigenous children and lost every single one of them. He needs to say that he will accept the Human Rights Tribunal ruling that found them guilty of willful and reckless discrimination and pay the compensation. If the Prime Minister then wants to talk about the class action lawsuits, that's fantastic. But there is no moving beyond the question that until the legal actions against this generation of Indigenous children are ended, there will be no ability for this Prime Minister to claim that he is on the path of justice. Did you want to speak? No? Did you want to speak?
Sure. Again, it's the same thing that we discussed over and over for generations, you know, because when they first created the residential schools, then the 60 schools, then the child welfare system came into place. There is a lot of continuation of that kind of abuse. You know, I think we really have to really focus on, okay, what is reconciliation? You're not doing what you're doing, and you're still taking my children away from their homes, and they're being a commodity, you know. And I think again, who's getting rich from my people? Who's getting rich from my children, my grandkids? Who's going to take care of them? I am. So they need to make very clear picture on what are they going to be doing about, you know, what I just talked about. You know, I'm sorry, but that's how I feel. Thank you.
In response to that question, Anishinaabe Aski Nation also has intervener status along with the Caring Society and AFN. And we stand firm that our children are discriminated, just as our survivors were. And, you know, we call call upon the Canadian government, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, to comply with those orders. He has spent enough money fighting against us, fighting against our children. Thank you.
Other questions?
We will now take questions on the phone. Operator?
Thank you, merci. Please press *1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. Our first question is from Jorge Barrera of CBC News. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
So, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien on Tout le monde en parle said that he had no idea that there was anything bad happening in residential schools when he was Indian Affairs Minister. Just wondering if anybody has a comment on this, particular Charlie, given what we know about letters from St. Anne, about St. Anne's to Chrétien.
I think one of the most moving things I found in the evidence of St. Anne's was a handwritten letter from a teacher to Jean Chrétien in 1968, telling Jean Chrétien that crimes were being committed against children, that he, as the Indian Affairs Minister, had to step up and do something. And Jean Chrétien never responded. Imagine if he had read that letter and thought, I should do something. How many children could have been saved? Because some of the worst crimes were being committed at that time. So it is outrageous for Jean Chrétien today to try and whitewash his role at St. Anne's Residential School, because he knew people reached out to him and they begged him to do the right thing, and he ignored them.
Follow up?
Yes. On St. Anne's and what's happening, we know that Justice Canada deleted a section on the OPP investigation and convictions from the school narrative that they had during the previous version, that ADR process. And we still don't really know why this happened and why the under Trudeau, that happened under Harper, under Trudeau, the federal government fought tooth and nail on reopening these cases for all these years. I'm just wondering if this is an issue that in a minority government, a parliamentary committee could really investigate and get to the bottom of what was the reasoning and the whys this all happened.
Well, I'm really hoping that given the new awareness that exists in the Canadian public about the mass crimes that were committed against Indigenous children, crimes that fit the international tests of crimes against humanity, that the Prime Minister will recognize his obligation to do the right thing. He spent millions fighting St. Anne's survivors. They've spent millions trying to make it appear as though justice had been done and to denigrate the claims and survivors such as Stella Chapman and Evelyn Korkmaz, Angela Shishish, who came forward, Edmund Matatawaban, and all the others who are not named. We could examine this at a parliamentary hearing, but really this is about the Prime Minister's personal credibility on the file of reconciliation. He needs to do the right thing now. He needs to say he will meet with the St. Anne survivors.
Next question on the phone.
Nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment. There are no further questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Merci.